Hello, this is Miss Bojanowski. I wanted to give us a brief overview of Gabriel Garcia Marquez as an author and then go into the first short story that we're reading with him, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. So I put together this brief presentation that's based on the biography that I'm having you all read. So, one thing that you should know is that he did not invent magical realism. It was actually invented well before him, but he was one who made it very, very popular with literature. And he did pass away in 2014. I was very saddened when I heard the news. He's actually one of my favorite authors ever. So you should know that he was born in Aracataca, Colombia in 1928. He lived with his maternal grandparents until he was 8 years old, and they would actually have a pretty big influence on him as a writer. While he was studying law in college, he worked as a journalist, and even though his family really wanted him to become a lawyer, he put that aside and chose to pursue a career as a journalist. So he worked for the local paper, the El Espectador, but then he also, because he was a foreign correspondent, he was able to travel to Paris, Eastern Europe, Venezuela, Cuba, New York, and Mexico. And while he was traveling, he did read voraciously. And so when he was in Eastern Europe, he was exposed to Franz Kafka, and you can see a lot of the themes of Kafka in Marquez. When he was in New York, I think he actually met Faulkner. Faulkner was also a big influence on him, so he kind of picked up a lot of different styles. When he was younger, his grandfather, who was raising him until he was 8, he was a colonel in Colombia's Civil War. So you will see if you look through all of his major novels, quite a few of them do deal with war. His grandmother, on the other hand, she spent a lot of time with the young Gabo, and she used to tell him, folk tales, but then also ghost stories, which really kind of mix the fantastic, the real, and a little bit of myth. And he said that they haunted him. And we'll get to a slide where he kind of explains his grandmother's influence. This is actually a picture of him as a young boy. And this is his autobiography. And yeah, this is a quotation that really kind of explains the grandmother's influence. He says, "The tone that I eventually used in 100 Years of Solitude," this is his major novel that kind of put him on the map and then also gave him the Nobel Prize for Literature, says, "was based on the way my grandmother used to tell stories. She told things that sounded supernatural and fantastic, but she told them with complete naturalness. What was most important was the expression she had on her face. She did not change her expression at all when telling her stories, and everyone was surprised. In previous attempts to write, I tried to tell the story without believing in it. I discovered that what I had to do was believe in them myself and write them with the same expression with which my grandmother told them, with a brick face." And you will see that he does have a profound sense of humor, but if you read it, sometimes you can skip through it. You have to kind of go back. It's sometimes a little bit in between the lines. So the other thing you should know is that he did take that journalistic quality that he began writing with to his fiction. So he would blend all the facts as you would report them in the news. When he was describing the supernatural or the magical, he would give you that same kind of detail and the same, bombardment of facts, just one fact right after the other, right after the other, right after the other, to the point where you almost believe, you're convinced that what is supernatural could be real. Okay. So we see, for example, in the short story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, the man with wings and the miracles that he performs, they're really explained in minute detail to the point where you have to almost question perhaps they did take place because there's so many facts to support them. His style of magical realism was pretty unique. He did definitely contrast a dreamlike and everyday reality. He definitely borrows from local myth and local folklore. And I thought this was a good description of his characters. It said, "The substance of some characters is incredible, in other words, not realistic, yet the details through which they are described are themselves highly realistic." So I think that's really kind of his mastery there. And the research also said the essential solitude of individuals facing love and death in society of which they never quite seem apart. So you will have themes of isolation and alienation that he's definitely borrowing from Kafka. So this is they must have put on some kind of play with these, it almost looks like paper mache characters, and this is supposed to be the man with wings as he's in his cage, his little chicken coop. So, themes that you're going to see, definitely the oral storytelling and folklore of Colombia. He's native to Colombia. And then also, he borrows from Franz Kafka the allegory of the human condition and its fall from innocence with images of alienation and isolation. So, definitely take a look for those. Major works you should know from him: 100 Years of Solitude. If you ever have to read it, get a copy that has the family tree in the front because you'll need it. There's so many characters with duplicate names that you need that family tree. Love in the Time of Cholera is the first novel I read by him. I fell in love with him with that one. It was made into a major motion picture. Leaf Storm is a collection of short stories that both of our short stories are coming from. Chronicle of a Death Foretold, and Love and Other Demons, which is my personal favorite. It's, I think, the funniest of all of his novels. Here's some quotations just to kind of get his sense of humor. He says, "What matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it." Kind of Faulkner-esque that one is. He says, "The interpretation of our reality through patterns not our own serves only to make us ever more unknown, ever less free, ever more solitary." And that, I think, works with some of the themes he has in his novel. And then here's a sense of humor. Fiction was invented the day Jonas arrived home and told his wife that he was 3 days late because he had been swallowed by a whale. So these are the references I used. I kind of went to the Norton Anthology, borrowed a little bit from Magical Realism, this book, as well as the biography that I had you read. So without any further ado, let's kind of take a look with A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. And really what I want to pay attention to is the setting. The village is definitely by the sea, and that's important because I think if it had been in an urban area, not so isolated, it would have been a completely different tale. Also, the atmosphere is odd and it starts off almost dreamlike with this infestation of crabs. We're going to definitely look at the characters. The old man with wings, how his physical description definitely is in contrast with traditional angels who are normally shown with, white wings. They're kind of young and good health. They usually have this halo around them, which means that they are, marked with God's grace. And even though they don't perform miracles, they are themselves miraculous. And the whole idea of the angel is that they are messengers from God. So here we see the angel visiting Mary to tell her, hello, you are going to be giving birth to the Son of God. So we're going to look at Pelayo and Elisanda. Initially, they see the old man as a nightmare, but then they quickly think that he's familiar. They place him in a cage and they charge admission to see him. So we're going to look and see exactly what idea that represents. The neighbor woman is interesting. She thinks he's the angel of death from Exodus. Father Gonzaga, who's a man of faith and the spiritual leader of the community, I want to look at how he reacts to the angel. And of course, the man with wings, his stiff competition, the maiden spider kind of chimera. She participates in her own spectacle and she has her tale of woe that she says, and she definitely gives the guy with wings a run for his money. The central conflict we're going to look at, the identity. They really can't figure out who he is. He certainly is a test of faith, and he also kind of reflects the lack of humanity that he's received in the town with. So let's go into our readings. So we're going to come here to week 4 with the readings. And just, you can click right here and it will pull you up to A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. Now we know that when we read the first paragraph, it's really important to understand the setting, this main conflict that we have, and also the tone. So it says, on the 3rd day of rain, they killed so many crabs inside the house that Pelayo had to cross the drenched courtyard and throw them into the sea, because the newborn child had a temperature all night and they thought it was due to the stench. So, third day of rain really isn't that extraordinary that there's so many crabs that they're coming into the house. That is, okay? It said the world had been sad since Tuesday. That's an odd description, too. If you went up to your best friend and said, "Hi, how are you doing?" and they said, "The world has been sad since Tuesday." It's just a very odd description. Sea and sky were a single ash gray thing, and the sands of the beach, which on March nights glimmered like powdered light, had been a stew of mud and rotten shellfish. So you could barely see the horizon, which is supposed to be this demarcation between the sky and the sand, because it's all kind of just shades of gray. And it says the light was so weak at noon that when Pelayo was coming back to the house after throwing away the crabs, it was hard for him to see what it was that was moving and groaning in the rear of the courtyard. He had to go very close to see that it was an old man, a very old man, lying face down in the mud, who, in spite of his tremendous efforts, couldn't get up, impeded by his enormous wings. So the landscape is almost kind of dreamlike with these crabs, and it's very overcast. You really can't tell what's what, and it's hard to see what's happening. And then we have this creature that would be shocking for anyone to go into their backyard and find. And his initial reaction, Playo's initial reaction, is to think that, he's a nightmare and to be frightened by it. And of course, he goes to get his wife. I think that's very good. And they both looked at the fallen body in mute stupor. He was dressed like a rag picker. And I really want us to pay attention to this physical description of the man with wings, because it is in sharp contrast with what we traditionally think angels are. He was dressed like a rag picker. There were only a few faded hairs left on his bald skull, and very few teeth in his mouth, and his pitiful condition of a drenched great-grandfather took away any sense of grandeur he might have had. His huge buzzard wings, dirty and half-plucked, were forever entangled in the mud. They looked at him for so long and so closely that Pelayo and Elisanda very soon overcame their surprise and in the end found him familiar. Okay, so here he is, a stranger, finding himself in this backyard, and they just don't know what to make of him. He doesn't look like anything that they would recognize as somebody with wings, which would be typically either Icarus, who had the wax wings and flew to the sun and they melted and he fell to the sea. That's Greek mythology. Or angels, which, comes from our Christian tradition. So, yeah, and so the neighbor woman is the first one to really kind of try and identify who this man is, and she says he's an angel and he must have come for the child. That's why I think that, she kind of pegs him as the angel of death, because in Exodus, when Moses went to the Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," and the Pharaoh said no, they had all these plagues that were visited upon them, and the last one was the angel of death. And if you didn't put the lamb's blood over the door, then the firstborn son would be taken by the angel of death. So this is not really a good way to start off, and we can see that the man with wings seems to be alienated right from the word go. It's a very negative kind of connotation. So they decide, people wanted to do all sorts of weird things for him. They're like, we can't club him to death. Well, that's very nice of you. In the end, they put him in the chicken coop, and the priest comes in. Now, the priest, he is he's the leader of the spiritual community, and so he does have a lot of clout. And if he's going to recognize a miracle, if anyone is, he's going to. And he really holds his doubts with him, okay? And he said that the parish priest had his first suspicion of an impostor when he saw that he did not understand the language of God, which would be Latin, by the way, not Aramaic, or know how to greet his ministers. So, the poor guy's not doing anything, and so that is his first failure with the test that the priest is giving him. Then he knows that seen close up, he was much too human. He had an unbearable smell of the outdoors. The backside of his wings were strewn with parasites, and his main feathers had been mistreated by terrestrial winds, and nothing about him measured up to the proud dignity of angels. And so when he came out, he reminded them that the devil had the bad habit of making use of carnival tricks in order to confuse the unwary. So basically, Father Gonzaga, he's condemning the man with wings as being an imposter. Okay, so nobody's really quite identifying exactly what or who he is, but I thought it was really funny that he said, nevertheless, he promised to write a letter to the bishop so that the latter would write his primate, so that the latter would write the supreme pontiff in order to get the final verdict. So, in other words, it was going to go up the chain of commands in the Catholic Church to arrive at the Pope's desk to be like, hey, we don't know if we have a miracle here or not, but there's a man with wings on our, in our town. So, I thought that that was really kind of ironic and maybe a little bit hypocritical. I don't know. You can decide. And so it's really quite interesting that people came from far away to really try and see if he was miraculous. He had these wings, so they think he can perform miracles. So we have these unfortunate invalids, and this is really Marquez kind of playing fun. He said, it's a poor woman who since childhood had been counting her heartbeats and had run out of numbers. That's a weird illness. A Portuguese man who couldn't sleep because the noise of the stars disturbed him. And I remember when I first read this short story, I thought, is that the Copernicus of spheres where the crystalline spheres make music? I don't know. And we have a sleepwalker who got up at night to undo the things that he had done while awake, which really kind of reminds me of Penelope in not the Odyssey, but the Iliad, where she's undoing the shirt that she's making, so she doesn't have to talk to the suitors. But really, he doesn't do anything. He just kind of sits there, and so he doesn't really participate in the show that he has become. And they're really quite mean to him. They throw him mothballs because they think that's what angels eat. I've never heard of such thing. An eggplant munch, which does not sound very appetizing. They pulled out feathers. They even burned his side with an iron for branding steers. So the treatment of this man who, is just found amongst their midst is very inhumane. I mean, it's you wouldn't treat another person like this. And so really, I think the big challenge comes from this woman who'd been changed into a spider, and she is set up as a sideshow as well. And she's the size of a ram with the head of a sad maiden. And the thing is that she has this tale of woe where she snuck out at night without her parents' permission, and she had gone dancing. And so when she was coming back through the woods, a fearful thunderclap, rent the sky in two, and through the crack came the lightning bolt of brimstone that changed her into a spider. So even though, I have never heard any kind of mythology where you have somebody who's part spider and part maiden, but they seem to accept her because she tells them her tale and she eats the meatballs that they show her. And so they believe her, which I think is really quite ironic because she seems so strange, but they don't believe the man in wings, okay? And I think at this point in time, I thought it was really interesting, too, that they call in a doctor because the child, they wanted to make sure that the child was okay. And the doctor, let me see if I can find him real quick. Sorry. I thought was really kind of interesting because when he came and examined the angel, he couldn't resist it. He said that he really was shocked that he was still alive, that the whistling of his heart, and there's so many sounds from the kidneys. But what surprised him most was the logic of his wings. He seemed so natural on that completely human organism that he didn't understand why other men didn't have them too. And so nobody can really identify who this man is. But I think the one thing that was really kind of interesting is that the only supernatural virtue that this man with wings has is his patience. Not his wings, apparently, just his patience. So, that's the only thing that they can really kind of recognize. Now, at the end of the short story, it is quite ironic how Elisanda and Palaio really benefit from this man with wings. They're able to build a second story onto their mansion. Palaio has, a rabbit warren close to town to give up his job as bailiff for good. Elisanda's got her nice little satin pumps and the dresses of iridescent silk. So they seem to have done really well with the man with wings. He, on the other hand, not so much. He's allowed into the house, but she seems to be, Elisanda seems to be really upset with him. At one point in time, she thinks he's replicating himself, and she shouted that it's awful living in a hell full of angels. But really, at the end, we want to look at the outcome of the short story. And it's December, so we went from March to December. It's really important to know that she's in the kitchen cutting onions. When you're cutting onions, you cry. When you cry, you might not know what you're seeing because you have tears in your eyes. So she's at the window, and the angel who's been growing in the weather, his wings, he has his first attempts at flight. He's very clumsy. He barely makes it into the air, but he did manage to gain altitude. And Elisanda let out a sigh of relief for herself and for him when she watched him pass over the last houses, holding himself up in the same way with the risky flapping of a senile vulture. So he leaves, finally. I don't blame him. She kept watching him even when she was through cutting the onions, and she kept on watching until it was no longer possible for her to see him, because then he was no longer an annoyance in her life, but an imaginary dot on the horizon of the sea. So he's been reduced to not only a dot, but an imaginary dot at the edge of the sea. So when we come back to, the outcome of the short story, they've never been able to identify him. He was always a stranger, alienated, really not treated very fairly at all. As a test of faith, if he is a messenger of God, if he is an angel, nobody really quite passed it. Nobody really looked at him and were very reverent to him. And it really does kind of pull out the lack of humanity. No one was kind to him except for maybe the doctor, okay, who was just more curious about him than anything else. And so I think that Marquez really is kind of looking at the difference between belief and faith. You say you believe these certain tenets, but when your faith is tested, no one seems to really cling to their faith. I mean, if you're going to be Christian, you really should be hospitable to your fellow human being and not brand them with something you would use for cattle. So Marquez really, I think he does this in a very humorous way, but it does have some social implications. And typically when we look at magical realism, it is used to kind of have a little bit of a critical approach to society or to man. So I'll just leave that up for you to decide. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care.